Welcome, folks, to this module on Cat 2, Cat 3 Autoland. What I want to do with this module is we have it set up with a dogleg to the localizer for the approach. I'm going to pause this here in a few minutes when we get leveled in at 8,000 feet, and I want to talk about a couple things in regard to this approach, which will back up some of the information that I had mentioned in a previous PowerPoint module on this session. But at this point, what I want to do is just cover a couple important points that relate to this type of approach. Number one, I had mentioned earlier that if you are going to be involved in making this approach, your company will likely have some guidance on briefings and on procedures for this approach. Some airlines will have some pretty clear defined duties during this approach for the flying pilot, the non-flying pilot. Most important is some of the indications that you're going to have along the way. Now, where it really becomes absolutely important to be really on your game is when you get down below 1,000 feet, and as you get closer into those areas of where you're having to make a determination on the conditions at minimums, whether to get in or to go around. Now, I wanted to mention too that when you have visibilities that are really down in this area of minimum visibilities for most airlines to make approaches, recognize that fog banks are variable. You may, at any given spot along your course of flight, have better weather conditions than what is being transmitted to you via any other kind of means. You may also have worse conditions. So recognize that there is a variable to this. For instance, you may be able to land at minimums, but during a rollout, you may lose all visibility. That's something that you'll have covered in training and handle that. But the point is, recognize there's a lot of variables that may be associated with the weather and the conditions itself. But the thing that I really want to point out that's important is make sure when you are involved in any kind of briefing that you have about making this approach that you cover all of the details. A lot of this is going to be beyond what's a normal briefing. You only do these approaches very rarely in these kinds of weather conditions that are down at some of these bare Cat 2, Cat 3 minimums. And because it's so critical to be able to make appropriate calls and determinations on whether to proceed or whether to go around, and the indications that are required in order to proceed. It's all done in split seconds. And these split seconds are very critical to applying this approach. And my suggestion is you brief and you cover these procedures in detail prior to making this approach, understanding what each pilot's responsibility is and how you're going to handle and recall a lot of this information. So in any case, I want to make that point. Now, in this particular case here, gang, we are on this dogleg to an intercept of the localizer. We are at 8,000 feet, we're on a heading, and we have been slowed by ATC to 190 knots, and they've assigned 8,000 feet, and we just leveled at that altitude. So now you can see that on both nav displays here, we have good depiction of the approach and the active waypoint that is ahead of us, and we're on a heading here, heading toward the localizer. So I'm going to continue with this and get in motion. But here's the other thing, too, that I covered before I want to cover again. Be ahead of the aircraft, situational awareness. In this case, just on average, you should be 7 steps ahead of where you are here right now in anticipating what comes next, what indications I'm going to have, when I execute something, what indications am I going to have, and what does that lead to in the next step? Be thinking ahead. Be aware of what is not only next, but what is 3 and 4 and 5 steps out. When you complete one, think ahead to the next. It's very important to stay ahead of the airplane. That's just basic flying. But in this case here, a lot of this is going to be kind of at a moderate pace to start with, and then it's going to get very rapid at the scans that you need and that the indications that you need. So we'll unglue here and get started. Okay, we're on this, and at this point, we are just being vectored to this approach. Again, one of the things that I have talked about in the past is give yourself appropriate scaling. Now, in this case here, the flying pilot is here in the left seat, the non-flying pilot is over here in the right seat. So we have our screens at 2 different dimensions of distance, but we have an active waypoint, which is here before us on the flying pilot side, and that's to probably be a requirement in most airlines, okay, but in any case, it should be for you. All right, the ATC gives us a turn to a heading of 310, heading 310, intercept the localizer cleared for the ILS approach. So we go up to the heading knob, and one thing I want to mention on this heading knob is look down here to actually set the heading. So I get the right knob, and what I want to do is turn it over to a heading of 310, and I want to intercept the localizer. So here on the mode control panel, I engage the localizer and look to see that I have an arm on my FMA. Now the other things that I'm looking for here, I see that the localizer just became alive. So I'm looking and I'm scanning on the localizer, the glide slope. When I get within 1 dot, that's when the Vorlope should capture. So I see that I have a Vorlope capture. Now, whether that's a call or not with your respective airline, that's part of your procedure and your guidance. But as soon as you get that localizer capture, then go up to the mode control panel and engage the approach. When I engage the approach, I want to see that I have a white glide slope, that it is armed. Now, the other thing that I want to do at that point, it's kind of a group of 3 at this point. I want to take my heading and bring it up to the inbound course. Never have a lazy heading bug. So what am I looking for next, gang? I want you thinking about what I'm looking for next. Get your scans all around here. Get your scans on your nav display. You know, eventually we're going to bring this into play here with a flight path angle vertical bearing. It's just a backup to some of the information that we'll have with a glide slope. So at this point, we're going to slow to 170 knots. So with that, I can see that I have to go to another flap setting that is going to be 5 degrees. So I'll go to 5 degrees, and once I see that it started and I can see that the flaps are extending, I'll go ahead and set my bug. It may be an assigned speed that they give you, or that you can fly whatever you're allowed to on your own at this point. Now here what we did is have a glide slope capture. We had the glide slope alive. Now generally with a glide slope alive, it's a good time to put the landing gear down, but in this case we're well above the normal intercept altitude. So we're going to lower the landing gear. We're going to go to flaps 15 degrees and then set our bug at 15. And next thing we have a glide slope capture. We had that just a while back here. So with that, there's 2 things I need to do at this point. I can go ahead and engage the second autopilot. Notice we have single channel here with this. But at 1,500 feet radio altimeter, we're going to get a bit check, which you'll see on your glide slope and your localizer indices, and then it will go to command. But I can also set, since I have captured the glide slope, I can go ahead and set my missed approach altitude, which I can get out of my FMC. I don't have to go look at a chart or be distracted from my attention being here and here. I can go ahead and scale a little bit lower here on my pilot monitoring side. I can also do the same over on my side. I'm at the final approach fix. I'm a little slow on getting this accomplished because I'm explaining things to you, but we're going to go to final flap setting. Now what happened is we had that bit check. It went into command with both autopilots and I got a flare arm. That's important to have this flare arm for the autopilot landing. And I'm going to be freezing this at certain points here as we continue on this approach. Here's where it's going to start to get busy with scans that involve my FMA with a flare, with the auto throttles, and we're going to be looking at runway symbol come up. We're going to eventually lose the roll cue, pitch cue. We'll talk about some of those things when we freeze things here. But this is where we're starting to fish and cut bait. At 200 feet, now notice that the runway symbol is moving up. At 100 feet, we just saw a flash of the surface here. Here's where we're looking. Out here as a pilot monitoring, the pilot flying is in all likelihood going to be very much involved in watching this flare arm. Now here's what we're going to have happen. At 100 feet, the roll cue and the pitch cue are going to disappear and we'll just have the runway symbol. At 50 feet, we're going to get a green flare. And then at 30 feet, we're going to get a retard on the throttle. But our minimums, we're looking to have a minimum decision at 50 feet radio altimeter. And right now it's looking optimistic in that at least I had a flash over on the side here. So we'll press on here. We'll look at what we have again as we get a little bit lower here. Okay, there's 50 feet. We have a green flare. And notice now we've got the runway. Now this, in this simulator model here, this is a little bit different than what you'd see in the real world. This is the end of the runway. In a real world, it's going to take you down to the 1,000-foot point. This is just probably a simulation condition here. But what you're going to do is see the touchdown zone on a real Cat 3 at about 50 feet, 40 feet, but it's going to be a solid line here. So anyway, we got that flare green at 50 feet. Notice we're at 42. Now watch what happens here when we get to 30 feet. Got the retard, touchdown, and then when we do the auto throttles disconnect. Now with this here, gang, is that, well, once we touch down, remember I talked about in a previous lesson, you could have a slight crosswind crash in this condition because the airplane has a capability of landing even Cat 3 in a crosswind condition, has limitations which generally is around 10 knots. May be different at different airlines, but in any case, it might be a slight crash. So if you have a system that has automatic localizer tracking, it'll correct itself with the autopilot still engaged. But if it doesn't have localizer tracking, the autopilot will disengage, or if your system, you may have to disengage it, and then with your own rudder control, bring the aircraft nose to track down the center line of the runway. Again, what I want to be advising you is that just because right now we got some guidance here, and you're going to have it, this one thing we don't have in this depiction here with the simulation, we don't have lights. It maybe looks like there's a few lights here, but you're going to have excellent lighting conditions with touchdown zone lighting and runway centerline lightings. Otherwise, you wouldn't be making this approach. But the point is this, gang, that I want to make clear. I mentioned earlier, in these conditions, you may be able to have good visibility all the way down the runway to a stop and be able to turn off. But recognize, too, you could go into a fog bank and lose that. And, recognize, again, that you may be able to pick it up. But that is those kinds of conditions, gang. You'll have your airline will have some guidance and training on how to handle that. Essentially in this case here, because we don't have the localizer here, we've lost some ability to do it instrument-wise. But in any case, I'm going to end it here. This is enough information on at least some familiarity with making a Cat 2, Cat 3 Autoland. Big thing, quickly in review. Once you get a glide slope capture, go ahead and engage the second autopilot. When you get the bit check at around 1,400, 1,500 feet radio altimeter, I'll get blinking indices of glide slope and localizer. There'll be 3 blinks, and then it will go into command, which allows you to continue to an Autoland approach. The white flare you will get with the second autopilot on, and it goes through the bit check. You must have that white flare, I think certification-wise, is by 800 feet. Your airline will have some guidance and restrictions or guidance on that. And then when we get down to 100 feet, we're going to lose, we'll have the runway symbol for localizer guidance, and we'll lose the roll cue and the pitch cue. And then at 30 feet, we're going to see a retard where the aircraft goes into an automatic flare and reduction in idle power. And then at touchdown, the auto throttles will disconnect. And in some systems, if you don't have localizer guidance, the autopilot will disconnect. And if you have localizer tracking, that'll be great guidance that you have and you can depend on. But probably in most cases, you're going to be involved in a little bit of this manual tracking, even at these low visibilities. So again, this is it on the Cat 3 Autoland, and I hope there's some information here that will be useful to you in a real world notice. When you start making this approach, and I was doing some talking here, if I was just observing here, I would have been ahead of some of what you saw. Stay ahead. Know what comes when, know what the indications are, and once you check that off, then go on, stay well ahead of the aircraft. All right, gang, hope this was helpful. And again, as I always want to say, good flying, take good care of that little old lady from Pasadena. And one of the things I'm going to say, I always used to do, in my later years of flying, I mentioned earlier, we're flying in an environment that's not natural for man. We made through all this technology and man wanting to fly like a bird, which is not our environment. I think it's a good idea, since we're working in God's environment, as well, to say a little prayer before every time you leave the gate each day of flying. And just a simple thing like, Lord, be my pilot, not my co-pilot, be my pilot. Guide me in thought, decisions, actions, and execution. Please be the wind beneath my wings. Always a good prayer for a pilot when you're working in God's world. God bless everybody.